I'm Vonetta Young. I am a writer, and I am also the Writer Center's newest board member, and I want to thank you all so much for being here. Special thanks to our panelists, to our workshop leaders, and to my fellow board member, Patrick Corvington, who's going to be moderating today. So as a nonprofit, the Writer Center depends very heavily on donations, large and small. So we want to give a special thanks to the Maryland State Arts Council for providing lead artist Melanie Figg with a creativity grant that made today possible. And we also want to give a very warm welcome to Anna Walker, who's here representing the Maryland State Arts Council. So thank you all so much again. Enjoy today, and I'm going to pass this to Patrick.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Vonetta. A hand for Vonetta. There'll be lots of applauding today. Thank you all for being here. This is such a unique and wonderful opportunity to talk about a set of issues. And just a quick plug that Through a Literary Lens, a series that we're doing at the Writer Center, that Amy's really leading up, and Amy's just been such a great leader in this space. Let's give her a big hand. And part of the sort of the gestalt behind it is the notion that as writers, we struggle or deal with or try and manage through a whole set of issues. And how we write about those through either personally or how we present those topics is so critical about how we express our stories. And so better understanding from folks, from people like you and folks on the panel here, how to tell those stories best and how our own experience impacts those stories is what really informed how we took on this set of work. So today, we're here to talk about mental illness and Through a Literary Lens. And we had some great workshops this morning. I know I wasn't at them, but I know they were great. I can tell by the looks on your faces, they were fantastic. Let's give a big hand for our panelists. So, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is just do a very quick introduction, and I'd like you to just dig into the conversation, and then you should have index cards for you to pass up questions. If you want me to ask your question, and I'm more than happy to, there's a very critical piece to that. I have to be able to read your handwriting. It's very important, okay? All right, so and then just feel free to pass them up as we're discussing, and then I'll go through them. So just want to quickly go through our panelists, who they are and why they're here. So first is our lead artist, Melanie Figg, who was really instrumental in pulling this together, a fantastic poet who has been at this for some time. Next we have GG, who has a website called, and I always forget how to say it, All the Many Layers. Thank you. All the Many Layers. All the Many Layers. And I really encourage you to check it out. I was spending quite a bit of time on it, actually. And life coach, writing about women, about women's empowerment, women finding their voices, all those things. Then we have Chen here, who is a writer and has written in The Atlantic, in the Washington Post, New York Times about depression and other mental health issues. We have Callen, who's also written about the set of issues, has a new YA novel that just came out. We'll talk about that a little bit. Then we have, of course, Abdul here, who has been writing quite a bit about a set of issues and has been leading workshops. You have. Has been leading a set of workshops, and just a wonderful addition to this panel. So let me just dig in and dive in and get going. So I'm going to start with you, GG, if I may. All right. You wrote an essay about choosing mental health over my mother, which I think was really profound and spoke a lot about your own struggles with it and how you dealt with it in terms of thinking about how you choose where you exist in terms of mental health issues. And it was undiagnosed, unacknowledged for years, right? And I think that many of us have had that experience. How did avoidance of the issue approach your own mental health, but how you chose to write about it?
Yes, so my mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was about 50. So growing up, we knew that there was some type of issue going on, but it wasn't discussed in our household. It was not acknowledged. And as a child growing up, nothing was explained to me. It was all about hiding the dysfunctional things that were happening, and I grew up thinking that that's how you dealt with problems like that. And writing is actually the thing that facilitated me bringing that part of my life into my identity and how I show up in the world. But it took a very long time. I didn't start writing about it or seeking help until I was about 30. So it was that avoidance that my family, that the approach that they took, which was no fault of their own in the Black community. You don't talk about mental health issues. You don't talk about mental illness. You hide it. You pray over it. And that was the solution. So I grew up thinking that whatever I had going on, whether it was unprocessed trauma from how I grew up or my own issues with anxiety and depression, the answer to that was to avoid it and to not talk about it. And in the essay, I had a moment where I realized that this is probably what led to my mother being undiagnosed for so long, and she felt like whatever was going on, she's a strong Black woman, she should be able to deal with it. She should be able to, this is her normal, she should be able to, overcome this, because that was how we were molded. So yeah, for me, it took so long for me to address it because that's what I thought you did, and that also helped me to find more purpose in writing about it, because I wanted to be part of changing that generational habit, that pattern of just hiding and pushing through it. I wanted to be part of changing that.
Thank you. The National Institute of Mental Health put out a piece last year about one of the biggest issues in mental health that we have to take on is stigma, right? And in communities of color, I'm from Haiti, that we struggle with this all the time about how do we talk about mental health? Does it exist? And what we ought to do about it. And so when you said pray about it, in our community, take baths. A lot of different kinds of baths. She's not feeling well, let's even take a special ginger bath and all that, Mom, I don't think it's gonna work. Rocky, if I could turn to you for a second. You are our YA novelist here, and you've got this great new book, A Breath Too Late, in which your main character, Ellie, struggles with a whole set of things. And in terms of her mother, her father, home life, death, all those kinds of things. So why did you decide it was so important, given all the things that are happening in the novel, why was it so important for Ellie to address depression specifically?
So with the novel, we learn from the first page that depression won and Ellie died by suicide. And the rest of the novel, every chapter is addressing things in her life, people in her life. And whether it's to her mother, to her father, to her home that she felt was a prison, but also to the depression. And the reason why I structured the novel that way is because as you read, everything's addressed to you. And I think it's so often that we forget we can be someone to someone else. Like in their story, we could be that mother, that best friend, that father. And we need to be able to understand our place in our own stories, but also in the stories of others, and what we can be an ally to people who are suffering. And with depression, the midway through the story, depression is addressed, and there's letters to depression. And the reason why I wanted to do that is so often when you're struggling with a mental illness, you really feel like you're wrestling with it, you're grappling with it, you are, toe to toe with it. And as someone who has struggled with these things themselves, it's important to remember that we're not the mental illness, we are a person with a mental illness. And so for Ellie, it was her way of making it its own entity, so that way she wasn't saying all of these things, this argument with herself, but with this thing that was dominating her life. And from a therapeutic standpoint, just the reading of that is supposed to be a reminder to all of us that we're not meant to wrestle with ourselves. We're meant to really understand the things we're grappling with and to step back, and so that way we can have the awareness, education, and therapeutic interventions to manage those symptoms and to manage those diagnoses, whatever it may be.
That's wonderful. You know, as I'm thinking about what you just said, I think I remember the book Unholy Ghosts that came out many, many, many years ago, or Black Pain that came out recently about depression in communities of color, but Unholy Ghosts about artists and writers writing about depression. And this notion that what you just said, that we are not the thing, or is that thing part of us? And the thing about mental illness, I think that we'll talk about a little bit, that is so difficult to understand for folks, but then to write about, is that, you know, when your leg hurts, it's one thing. But when you lose control of your own mind, it's a terrifying thing, right? When the pain is psychic in that way, it's a very different kind of thing. And I think it makes the writing hard and all that. Melanie, now you have this beautiful book of poetry called Traces, and it's an award-winning book. When did it win the award?
Well, 3 years ago.
3 years ago?
It came out just in October.
It's still #1 in my heart. And in that, you have a long poem called Leaving a Trace, in which you explore the history of mental illness, particularly in the Oregon State Insane Asylum. So what got you interested in that, and what does that poem really mean to the story of the book?
Well, I got interested in that subject through art. I write a lot about art, and I actually saw this book, these photos of David Meisel, who took these pictures, and I have it up later if you guys want to browse through it, but they're actually copper canisters of cremated remains from the State Insane Asylum. So, and each one, your body chemistry is matched with the copper, and so everyone's looks different. And it was this sort of kind of just amazing way to think about how we're all unique and we all matter and we all have this sort of story that's not happening, not being told. And I got very interested in the insane asylum. It's actually, then it was the State Mental Hospital. Now it's the Ohio State Museum of Mental Health. It's the only place in the country that's honest about what went on in these large state institutions like St. Elizabeth's in DC. So I read every book I could. I got a grant. I went out there. And by talking about the cremains and the history of the hospital and its noble idea that became quite a terrible place to live for people, I got to talk about my other themes that I'm interested in, which is identity and chance and memory and diagnosis, and families and how families ignore certain members and what happens and what this country has done to its people with mental illness and, you know, the homelessness issues that we deal with. So it let me talk about the politics and talk about family and talk about my own situation and talk about art and how we use art as a way to lance and salve whatever's our stuff to deal with. So it became a very long poem, as you can imagine. It's like 9 pages long, and it's one of the poems that in the book about mental illness, and there's a number of other poems in there too, but that's like the long one. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Abdul, if I may. In your book, Trouble Sleeping, you talk about mental illness, but from a particular perspective, which is insomnia. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that and why you approached it in that way.
Sure. Actually, I stumbled into the whole mental illness piece. When I wrote Trouble Sleeping, I was in graduate school, and like many of us who are in graduate school, I wasn't sleeping. But after a couple of weeks, I realized that maybe this was a little bit more than just restlessness. And then I had to, as I'm working on my thesis to graduate, what are those things that are keeping me up at night? So I had to confront those things. And so it became sort of life mirroring art.
More?
Sure.
Give us a little more.
A little more.
Yeah.
So, I started writing about my own things that I was struggling with. At the time, I was a relatively young father, and so there's a whole lot of anxiety about, am I up for this?
Right.
There's the family history issue. I had interesting parents. My fellow group members, they know what I'm talking about. And then, of course, there was a lot of national things going on that could be very triggering for people of color. Like when you turn on the news and another, person is another injustice or another. So there was all of that. So I was looking at trouble sleeping as sort of like personal, but also a national diagnosis.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm so glad you said that, because I think part of what I want to get into as we move through this conversation is that there is mental illness, mental health personally, but there's also what happens when a community is traumatized, and whether it's a specific geographic community or a group of people. And what that means historically, what that means when it's re-triggered presently, and those kind of things. And I'm going to tie that later, just a little quick heads up, to the rates of mental illness, undiagnosed mental illness in the Black community, and communities of color in general. But, Jenny, you've written quite a bit about this, and you've talked about it in a variety of different ways. Can you talk about how your own personal struggles with mental illness have affected your writing, whether or not writing was a vehicle also to work through some of that?
Yeah, sure. So some people who are in my workshop will hear this the second time. But I think, like a lot of my fellow panelists, I dealt with parents who struggled with a lot of undiagnosed mental illness and the intergenerational trauma that comes with it. And also in the Asian American community, we don't really talk about it. And because they were undiagnosed, it was like the anger and the struggle that I had towards the way that their mental illness was affecting them and therefore affecting me as a growing child, but they weren't acknowledging it and they weren't accepting it. And so I felt like all the emotions that I had, or the frustrations towards how I wanted my parents to be but weren't there for me, I felt those emotions were wrong. And so like I grew up feeling that way for a very long time. And I had been writing since I was young, but it wasn't until when everything kind of came to a head and I had to address my own depression and PTSD and all that kind of stuff, when I had to accept kind of like all the things that had happened in the childhood, but also kind of like the feelings I was having now. And I think writing really helped me acknowledge and reconnect with those memories and emotions. When growing up, we also moved around a lot, so I'd never had like a very strong community of people that I could compare my experiences to. And so like, even though my parents weren't really acknowledging my experience through writing, you can acknowledge your own experience and give yourself a voice.
So just sticking with that for a second, for you and GG actually, did writing about mental illness, your own experience and others, reconnect you to your parents' experience and create any kind of healing or reconnection of saying, I have this, you have this, in any kind of way?
For sure, yeah, and that's a great question. I think it's like a two-part thing. I think like in the beginning I really had to reconnect with my own anger and like the right to feel angry and to write about all like my own emotions. And writing about your own emotions makes you feel strong enough that you can sort of separate from your parents, which is something that we all have to do, but I think, or at least I can only speak for myself, but it feels a little bit difficult to do when you have all these like enmeshed things going on and you didn't have maybe like a clean break, and maybe they still want you, they still need you in some ways and you still need them. So like the first part of it was writing about my own experiences and giving myself the strength, my own voice. And then after having that independence and feeling like I had the right to feel the way that I did, then I was able to kind of see from a distance and have a lot more empathy with kind of their experiences and what they were going through and how much of it was similar to mine, of course, because they've kind of passed it along. but I also wrote a piece for Guernica about intergenerational trauma and a lot of what my parents had gone through growing up in the tail end of the Cultural Revolution and their parents, and kind of understanding a little bit more about just what kinds of things they had gone through, because I've only ever known them as my parents, since I was born. So.
Right. Thank you. Gigi?
Yeah, definitely helped me to heal in a different way with my mother. We're estranged, and I really didn't start trying to understand her situation or mine until we were already estranged. So it helped me to heal a lot of the memories that I had where I felt so much anger and pain and guilt and all of this negative emotion, and relook at it. And in my workshop, we talked a little bit about taking a memory where you saw yourself as a victim and reimagining it and trying to put yourself in the place of that other person, in this case my mother, and some of the things that would go on with her, and just trying to imagine what that must have been like for her to be raising a teenage daughter, she had to have some sense that she was losing herself in some way and just struggling to try to still push me along and just do the best that she could. I'm a mother now, I have 3 kids, I have teenagers, so at a key part of their lives when I was really struggling with anxiety and depression and trying to write about it, just thinking, oh, I'm awake, I'm woke, like I got this, I know how to go to therapy, I'm fine, I have it under control, and realizing and just feeling that connection with my mother, even though we're estranged and we don't talk, just feeling that connection with her, knowing I'm not in my right mind, but I still have to take care of these kids. I have to do anything I possibly can to be present for them, and I just can only imagine. I have so much support and information and awareness. She didn't have all of that. So I just can't even imagine how that must have, even in her own family and everything, it was just kind of not something that even if she wanted to talk about, even if she did reach out, I can imagine that it was not received. So it helped me to heal those feelings that I had towards her.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about craft for a second. I want to come back to some of these issues. I want to talk a little bit about craft because we have a poet on the panel, and then folks who write prose, right? Fiction, nonfiction. Oh, you're a poet as well. Oh, well, there we go. We have 2 poets. Holding up each side, as poets should. So can you talk a little bit about the difference in writing about mental health issues and about mental illness as a poet versus through essaying or through fiction? How do you take them? Melanie, why don't we start with you?
Well, I don't write fiction, so I don't know how that happens, but I'm happy. But I do write these long poems now, and for me, I don't know how I'm going to answer this, except space has become a really important part of a poem for me. White space is about absence and loss. I first discovered that when my mom died. It was a way to bring the idea of absence and loss into the poem in a formal way. And then a lot of the poems I write about, my sister is bipolar, and the mother of my stepchildren is unmedicated and homeless by who knows what her diagnosis is. So there's a way that space and stuttering and the dash and unanswered phrasing, right, incomplete sentences are ways that formally I'm able to bring in a lot of that stuff that's really hard, not knowing, are they okay? What's wrong with them? Why are they doing that? Are they safe? Am I safe? A lot of that stuff that can feel really didactic and preachy and too political, I can put in as formal elements. And the poems that I write about mental illness are actually the first poems that I've ever been political about. I feel like I have a lot of political opinions, but the ones, and maybe it's because I see that homelessness is really an issue for people with mental illness, and it's heartbreaking. And so in a weird way, I've been able to incorporate politics in poems that I would never have done otherwise. I would think that's too preachy and didactic, and I'm not sure all the things that have that be possible, but it's a new thing. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of cool. So I don't know. You know, I write about my own personal experience. I write about history. I write about politics. But I think there's a place where poetry, and we talked about this in the workshop, is when you, it's a lot of when, what if it's not your feelings? It's not just your journal. A poem should be a thing you craft and you can give away as a thing. And that's a really important piece. You know, journaling's awesome and it's a part of this process and it's a long part. But then there is a piece you want to craft to give away. And in that moment when you can give it away, you're kind of free of it. And that's always what's inspiring for me about art, is that ability to transform it. And then hopefully help someone else.
In the workshop that I did this afternoon, the first thing that I did was I asked each of us to write down a word that was triggering. And I said something like, language is always speaking. And I think poetry, we raise the stakes on language. We don't need 5 pages. You know, just give us whatever. And even an image can do the work that 100 words can do. So I think that's probably one of the major differences between poetry and prose. We work really hard.
I heard a throwdown.